There is something unmistakably revealing about the way anxiety has started leaking out of palace-aligned commentary, now that even voices sympathetic to Prince William are quietly admitting that Prince Harry is likely to have his UK security reinstated. Because if the Readmitting process were genuinely independent, impartial, and purely based on threat assessment, as the royal household and UK authorities have insisted for years, then there would be no need for preemptive briefings, no need for narrative shaping, no need for subtle panic dressed up as concern about precedent or optics. Yet what we are witnessing instead is a barely concealed fear of what happens when the truth is allowed to stand on its own without palace spin, because security was never just about protection. It was about leverage, obedience, hierarchy, and punishment. And the moment Harry and Meghan stepped outside the rigid confines of an institution that demands silence in exchange for status, that leverage was weaponized against them in a way that now looks increasingly indefensible. And the reason this matters so much is because Harry's risk profile did not vanish when he stopped being a working royal. His birthright, his visibility, his history, and his mother's fate did not suddenly become irrelevant. And anyone pretending otherwise has been relying on willful ignorance rather than evidence. Because the threats were documented, the hostility was public, and the media ecosystem that fed off dehumanizing Meghan while trivializing Harry's warnings never paused to ask whether it was contributing to the danger it later dismissed. And now that the possibility of security reinstatement is being openly acknowledged, the cracks in the official story are widening, exposing just how fragile the palace's claims of neutrality have always been. Because if this were simply a technical administrative matter, there would be no emotional reaction from Prince William's camp, no whispers of concern about embarrassment, no frantic attempts to downplay what security restoration would symbolically represent, which is an admission that the system failed in its most basic duty of care, not once but repeatedly, and that failure becomes even more uncomfortable when contrasted with the palace's eagerness to protect its image while allowing two of its members to be scapegoated for daring to set boundaries. And it is impossible to ignore how much of this panic appears rooted in narrative control rather than genuine concern for process. Because for years, the public has been fed a simplistic morality tale in which William is the steady heir and Harry the troublesome spare, a framing that collapses the moment Harry's claims are validated by independent review, because security reinstatement does not just protect Harry physically, it undermines the story that he exaggerated, manipulated, or manufactured fear for sympathy, and instead confirms that his concerns were grounded in reality, that the risks were known, and that they were ignored or minimized until legal scrutiny made denial untenable. And this is precisely why the idea of Harry returning to the UK under conditions that affirm his safety and autonomy is so destabilizing to the royal narrative, because it challenges the assumption that exile was a consequence of irresponsibility rather than a rational act of self-preservation. And it reframes Meghan not as an interloper who destabilized the monarchy, but as a woman who identified an unsafe environment and refused to accept institutional gaslighting as the price of belonging. And the UK tabloids have played an indispensable role in maintaining the illusion that Harry and Meghan were the problem, because their business model depends on outrage, repetition, and dehumanization, particularly when the target is a woman of colour who does not perform deference, and time and again the press chose access over accountability, amplifying anonymous palace sources while dismissing the Sussexes' lived experience as whining, despite the obvious parallels to Diana's treatment and the well-documented consequences of sustained media harassment. And when Harry explicitly warned that history was repeating itself, he was mocked rather than listened to, his trauma reframed as paranoia, his protectiveness toward his wife and children portrayed as melodrama. And now that the same system appears poised to quietly reverse course on security, the refusal to acknowledge error becomes glaring, because instead of reflection, we see defensiveness, instead of empathy, we see resentment, and instead of accountability, we see attempts to reframe the outcome as inevitable rather than corrective. And Prince William's reported discomfort with this process is particularly telling, because it suggests that the issue is not whether Harry deserves protection, but whether acknowledging that need disrupts the carefully curated image of institutional competence and fraternal unity. And it raises deeply uncomfortable questions about why preserving hierarchy seems to matter more than acknowledging harm, and why loyalty to the system appears to outweigh loyalty to family. And this dynamic is not accidental but structural. embedded in a monarchy that has long prioritized the stability of the crown over the well-being of individuals, especially those deemed expendable. And Harry's role as the spare has always made him uniquely vulnerable to this calculus, because his purpose within the system was never autonomy but support, never truth-telling but containment. And the moment he refused that role, the system responded predictably by withdrawing protection and encouraging a media narrative that framed consequence as fairness, and yet fairness collapses under scrutiny when the same risks are treated differently depending on compliance. And this is why the insistence that security decisions are purely procedural rings hollow, because procedures do not require character assassination to defend them, and independent processes do not inspire fear in those who believe they will be vindicated by the facts. And the reality is that Harry and Meghan did not create a crisis by leaving. They exposed one that already existed, a crisis of accountability, transparency, and moral responsibility within an institution accustomed to deference and silence. And the UK media's refusal to interrogate this reality has only compounded the harm, because rather than examining how palace briefings shape coverage or how commercial incentives reward cruelty, many outlets doubled down on framing Harry and Meghan as disloyal, opportunistic, or attention-seeking, even as evidence mounted that their concerns were legitimate. And this selective skepticism has consequences, because it teaches the public that power should not be questioned, and that those who do question it deserve punishment. And the removal of security functioned as exactly that. A warning disguised as policy, sending a message that autonomy would be met with vulnerability, and that vulnerability would then be mocked, doubted, and monetized. And the fact that Harry chose to challenge this through legal channels rather than capitulation is precisely why the outcome now matters so much, because courts do not operate on palace whispers or tabloid headlines. They operate on evidence, and evidence has a way of dismantling narratives built on assumption and hierarchy, and even the quiet acknowledgement from royal-friendly commentators that Harry is likely to succeed speaks volumes about the strength of his case. And yet, rather than accepting this as an opportunity for institutional growth, the reaction from certain quarters suggests a desire to contain the damage rather than learn from it, because admitting that Harry was right means admitting that the system failed, and admitting failure threatens the illusion of moral authority that the monarchy depends on. And this is why the Sussexes continue to provoke such disproportionate hostility, because they represent a refusal to play the assigned roles, a challenge to the idea that suffering is noble when it serves tradition, and a reminder that dignity should not be conditional on obedience. And the irony is that Harry and Meghan have consistently articulated values that the monarchy claims to champion: service, compassion, mental health awareness. Yet they are punished for insisting those values be applied consistently rather than selectively. And the prospect of their safe return to the UK undercuts years of character assassination by demonstrating that their departure was not a tantrum, but a necessary boundary. And that distance was not abandonment, but survival. And this realization is profoundly uncomfortable for those who benefited from portraying them as unstable or ungrateful, because it shifts responsibility away from individual personalities and towards structural dysfunction. And if Prince William is indeed spiraling at the possibility of security reinstatement, it is not because the process is flawed, but because its outcome threatens a hierarchy that depends on unquestioned authority. And history shows that institutions rarely react calmly when their narratives are exposed as incomplete or misleading. And yet this moment also offers a chance for a different path, one rooted in accountability rather than defensiveness, in empathy rather than resentment, and in the recognition that protecting human beings should never be subordinate to protecting myths, because no crown, no tradition, and no media narrative is worth the cost of endangering lives. And as more people begin to see through the smokescreen of tabloid outrage and palace spin, the Sussexes' insistence on safety, truth, and autonomy becomes harder to dismiss, not because they are flawless, but because their experience resonates with anyone who has ever been told to endure harm quietly for the sake of appearances. And this is why the issue of security transcends logistics, because it exposes how power operates, how dissent is punished, and how truth eventually surfaces despite sustained efforts to suppress it. And if Harry's security is reinstated, It will stand as a quiet but powerful acknowledgement that safety should never have been used as a bargaining chip, that fear should never have been dismissed as inconvenience, and that the Sussexes were right to walk away from a system that demanded silence while denying protection, and no amount of retrospective spin will erase the reality that their choice was not reckless, but necessary, and that the panic we are seeing now says far more about the institution than it ever did about them.